The quiet beginning studio was buzzing that evening. Joe Rogan had invited many guests before, but tonight felt different. The audience leaned forward in their seats, waiting for the man who had built his life quietly, without shouting about his success. Keanu Reeves walked in with his usual calm presence. He was wearing a simple black shirt and jeans, no effort to stand out, yet every eye in the room followed him. There was no loud music, no flashy introduction. Only the sound of Joe greeting him with a warm handshake from the first moment. Viewers could sense something was about to unfold. Joe Rogan, known for his tough questions and curious mind, looked at Keanu with respect, but also with curiosity. He knew this was not just another interview. Keanu had a way of turning silence into power, and Joe wanted to see if he could bring out something the world had never heard before. As the cameras rolled, Joe asked the first question. Keanu, people know you as an actor, a generous man, someone who has faced tragedy and still stayed humble. But what do you think has shaped you the most? The room grew quiet. Keanu looked down for a moment, his face calm, but his eyes carrying years of untold stories. He did not rush to answer. He let the silence breathe, as if he wanted everyone to understand that not all truths come fast. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, almost gentle. I think pain has shaped me, Joe, but also kindness. Both of them live together inside me. When you lose people you love, the world feels broken. But when someone shows you a small act of kindness, it feels like light cutting through the dark. I have learned that one moment of kindness can save someone from falling. The audience was hooked. Joe leaned forward, surprised by the honesty in his tone. Can you give me an example? A moment where kindness saved you? Keanu nodded slowly, as if pulling a memory from deep inside. There was a time, long before the movies, when I was young and broke. I had lost my father, and my mother was working as hard as she could, but life felt heavy. One day, I was sitting on a bench, thinking about quitting everything. I had no money, no plan, and I felt invisible. Then, a stranger came by, sat next to me, and started talking. He didn't know me. He just said, whatever you're going through, don't give up. The world is waiting for you to stand up again. That moment stayed with me forever. I never saw him again, but those words kept me alive. The silence after his words was powerful. People could feel the weight of that story. Joe's eyes widened. He had not expected this. So you're saying one stranger's words kept you from giving up? Joe asked. Keanu looked at him, his expression filled with quiet strength. Yes, and it taught me something. It taught me that we never know how much our words or actions mean to someone. That's why I try to be kind, even when nobody is watching. Because maybe, just maybe, that small act will keep someone else alive too. The audience felt their hearts shift. Many people had come expecting to hear stories about Hollywood or action films, but what they got was a lesson about humanity. Joe sat back, his mind racing. That's powerful, man. But let me ask you this, how do you keep that humility, even with fame and money? Most people lose themselves. Keanu gave a soft smile. Fame is just noise, Joe. Money is just paper. When you strip it all away, you're left with how you treat people. I have slept on friends' couches. I have walked streets where nobody cared who I was. I remember those days, and I keep them close. It reminds me that respect is earned, not by status, but by kindness. I never want to forget that. Joe nodded, his expression serious now. He could sense that this conversation was going deeper than any headline, deeper than any viral clip, and then Keanu leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, almost like a secret. But Joe, I'll tell you something that no one expects. There was a time when I hated myself for being alive. I thought life had taken too much from me. But then something happened that changed everything. The audience held their breath. Joe looked at him with wide eyes, waiting for the story that was about to unfold. The tension grew heavier with every passing second. This was no longer just an interview. It was the beginning of a life lesson that would surprise everyone listening. The unseen Birdente studio lights seemed softer now, as if even they were leaning closer to listen. Joe Rogan adjusted himself in the chair, but his eyes never left Keanu. The moment had grown heavier, and the audience could sense that Keanu was carrying something deeper than what had been spoken. "You said there was a time you hated yourself for being alive," Joe said carefully. "What happened?" Keanu exhaled slowly, his eyes falling to the table between them. He didn't rush. Every pause felt like a bridge carrying him back to a memory that still hurt. Finally, he looked up, his voice quiet but steady. "I lost my sister," he began. "She was young, and she was full of dreams. Cancer took her away, piece by piece. I was there, watching her fight, and every day I felt powerless. I wanted to trade places with her. I wanted her to live and me to disappear. When she passed, I blamed myself. I thought I hadn't done enough. And in those nights alone, I hated myself for still breathing when she couldn't." The audience sat frozen. Joe swallowed hard, his voice softer now. "That must have been unbearable." Keanu nodded. "It was, and the pain stayed with me. I started moving through life like a shadow. People saw me smiling, working, acting, but inside I was broken. I carried guilt like it was part of my skin. And that's when the thought came to me, what is the point of living if everything you love is taken away?" His words cut deep, reaching into every listener's own fears and losses. "But then," Keanu continued, "one night, I was sitting by myself, thinking about ending it. I wanted the pain to stop. And then I remembered something. I remembered that stranger on the bench who once told me, 'Don't give up. The world is waiting for you to stand up again.' I thought about those words, and I realized maybe I was still here for a reason. Maybe my pain had a purpose. Maybe my sister would not want me to give up. Maybe she would want me to keep going, to carry her dreams with me." Joe leaned back, his eyes reflecting both respect and shock. "So you chose to live, even though every part of you wanted to stop?" Keanu nodded again. "Yes, I chose to live. But not just for me. I chose to live for the people I lost. I chose to live so that their stories would not disappear. And that choice changed me. It gave me strength I didn't know I had. It made me see life differently. Every smile from a stranger, every small act of kindness, every sunrise, it all became precious, because I knew how quickly it could be gone." The audience's silence was no longer just quiet. It was heavy, filled with respect. People felt their eyes burn with tears, not just because of his pain, but because of the strength hidden inside it. Joe's voice carried a mix of admiration and disbelief. "Keanu, most people would fall apart under that weight. How did you hold on?" Keanu gave a faint smile. "I didn't always hold on. Sometimes I broke. Sometimes I cried until I could not breathe. But I learned something important. Being strong does not mean never breaking. Being strong means breaking and still choosing to rise again. That is the only reason I am here today." His words landed like a wave, pulling hearts closer to him. Joe leaned in, almost whispering, "And that's the lesson, isn't it? That resilience is not about never falling, but about always rising." Keanu looked at him with calm eyes. "Exactly. Pain is real, Joe, but so is kindness. And when the to meet, something powerful happens. Pain humbles you. Kindness heals you. Together, they teach you how to live." The audience broke into soft applause, not out of excitement, but out of deep respect. They were no longer watching an interview, they were witnessing a man opening his soul. Joe looked around, then back at Keanu. "You know, people will never look at you the same after this conversation. They'll see more than just the actor. They'll see the man who carried pain and still chose kindness." Keanu's voice was steady. "If that's what they see, then it's enough. Because the truth is, Joe, life is not about how much we earn or how famous we become. It's about how much light we can give while we're here. That is all that matters. The cameras zoomed in. The world was about to remember these words. But no one knew yet that the biggest surprise, the deepest lesson, was still waiting to be revealed. The weight of silence at studio air had shifted. What started as a regular conversation now felt like a journey into the soul of a man who had endured more than most could imagine. Joe Rogan's listeners were used to intense debates, shocking stories, and laughter, but this was different. There was no noise, no comedy to break the tension. Only silence, heavy and powerful, wrapping around every word Keanu spoke. Joe leaned forward, his voice careful. Keanu, you've carried pain that would destroy many people. You've turned it into something meaningful. But how did you deal with the silence after all that loss? Silence can be louder than any noise, can't it? Keanu's face softened, his eyes drifting somewhere far away, as if he were standing again in those lonely nights. Yes, Joe, he said slowly. Silence was the hardest part. When you lose someone, people are there at first. They call, they send flowers, they check on you. But after some time, the world goes back to normal, and you're left with silence. The phone stops ringing, the door stops knocking, and you're alone with memories that don't leave. His voice trembled slightly, but it carried strength. I remember nights when the silence was so heavy it felt like it would crush me. I would sit in a dark room, just listening to my own heartbeat, wondering why I was still here. But then, I realized something. Silence is not always an enemy. Silence can also teach you. It can force you to face yourself. It can make you see the truth you try to run from. Joe nodded, his expression deep with thought. What truth did silence show you? Keanu took a long breath. It showed me that I could not change the past. I could not bring my sister back. I could not erase the pain, but I could choose what to do with it. I could drown in silence, or I could learn to sit with it until it no longer scared me. I started using silence to listen to myself, to the world, to the people around me. And in that listening, I discovered something important. Silence makes room for kindness. When you are not busy talking, you hear the pain in others. And when you hear, you can help. The audience shifted in their seats, as if those words struck their own lives. Many of them knew the same kind of silence, the silence after a breakup, after losing a job, after burying a loved one. Suddenly, they didn't feel so alone. Joe's voice lowered. So you're saying silence didn't just break you, it built you? Keanu's lips curved into a small, quiet smile. Yes, silence broke me many times, but it also shaped me. It taught me patience. It taught me humility. It taught me that real strength is not in shouting the loudest, but in listening the deepest. And that lesson changed the way I live. Joe raised his eyebrows. How so? Keanu leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. I stopped chasing noise. I stopped running after fame, after attention, after applause. Those things fade. But when you sit in silence with someone, when you listen to their story, when you make them feel seen, that lasts. It changes people. I started to value quiet, dinners with friends more than parties. I started to value sitting with strangers more than standing in front of cameras, because I realized something simple. Love is built in silence. Respect is built in silence. Healing happens in silence. The audience felt their hearts tremble at his words. It was not just advice. It was a confession of how he survived. Joe let out a slow breath. You know, man, that's not what people expect from a Hollywood star. They expect lights, red carpets, noise. But you're talking about silence as your teacher. That's rare. Keanu looked down, then back up with steady eyes. Because fame is a distraction, Joe. Silence is where the truth lives. I've learned more from silence than from any stage, any award, any headline. Silence forced me to grow. And I think that's the life lesson no one expects from me." A pause hung between them, filled with emotion. The cameras caught the weight of the moment. Viewers everywhere could feel it. Then Joe asked, almost in a whisper, "So what do you do now, when silence comes?" Keanu smiled faintly. "I welcome it. I sit with it. I let it remind me of the people I love. I let it remind me that life is short, and that every moment matters. Silence is no longer my enemy. It is my companion." The audience clapped softly, not because they were entertained, but because they had just been given a piece of wisdom that could change their own lives. What they didn't know was that Keanu was about to reveal something even deeper, an act of kindness he had never shared publicly, one that would turn this conversation into a story the world would never forget. The kindness no one saw. The studio had grown so quiet that even the hum of the equipment felt louder than usual. Joe Rogan leaned back, looking at Keanu with eyes that held more respect than curiosity now. The audience sat still, holding on to every pause, every word. People had come to see a famous actor, but they were witnessing something greater, a man opening the deepest parts of himself, teaching lessons without ever raising his voice. Joe cleared his throat softly. "Keanu, you've spoken about pain, silence, and resilience. But you also said kindness is what saves people. Can you share a moment when kindness changed someone else, the way it once saved you?" Keanu's gaze lowered for a moment, as though he was sifting through years of memories. His fingers brushed against each other gently on the table, and then he lifted his eyes again, calm but filled with quiet intensity. "There was a night," he began, his voice slow, "when I was walking home in Los Angeles. It was late, around 2 in the morning. The streets were empty, except for one man sitting on the sidewalk. His clothes were torn, his face tired, and in his eyes there was something I recognized: hopelessness. I could have walked past him like everyone else. I could have pretended not to see, but something inside me stopped me. Maybe it was because I remembered being that young man on the bench once, when a stranger saved me with just a few words." The audience leaned in closer, the image of Keanu alone on a quiet street painting itself in their minds. I sat down next to him. Keanu continued, and he looked at me like I was crazy. He asked why I was sitting there when I had everything in life. I told him the truth, that I didn't have everything. I had pain, I had loss, I had questions that still haunted me. I told him he wasn't alone, even if it felt like it. We talked for hours, about life, about dreams he once had, about mistakes he regretted. When the sun came up, I gave him some money, not just to survive, but to start again. I didn't tell him who I was. I didn't want to. I wanted him to see kindness without fame, without reason. Joe blinked, his face reflecting pure surprise. "So, did you ever see him again?" Keanu's eyes softened, and he shook his head slowly. "No, Joe, I never saw him again. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that for one night, he wasn't invisible. For one night, someone sat with him, someone listened. Maybe it didn't change his whole life, but it changed that moment. And sometimes, Joe, a moment is enough." The studio air thickened with emotion. The audience sat frozen, many holding back tears. It wasn't just the story of helping a stranger, it was the story of remembering humanity in a world that often forgets. Joe's voice dropped low, almost like he was speaking only to Keanu. "Man, that's powerful. Most people wouldn't do that. Most people wouldn't risk their time, their comfort, to sit with someone in the dark. But you did." Keanu leaned back, his eyes calm. "Because I remember what it felt like to be in the dark. I remember what it felt like to be saved by a stranger's words. And I promised myself that if I ever had the chance, I would be that stranger for someone else. Kindness is not about saving the world, it's about saving one soul at a time." The audience broke into gentle applause again, not loud, not rushed, but filled with respect. Joe stared at him for a long moment, then said, You know, people think of kindness as weakness sometimes, but listening to you, I realize kindness might be the greatest strength. Keanu's lips curved into a small smile. Kindness takes courage, Joe. It takes strength to care when it's easier not to. And that's something I wish more people understood. We live in a world where toughness is praised, but real toughness is choosing to stay kind even when life has broken you. The audience nodded, many silently agreeing, many thinking of their own lives and the people they had walked past without noticing. Joe leaned in, his voice carrying a note of suspense now. Keanu, you've shared something most people will never forget, but let me ask you this. What's the biggest lesson kindness has taught you personally? Keanu's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with focus. It taught me that every human being is carrying a weight you cannot see. The richest man, the poorest man, the loudest, the quietest, they all carry something heavy. And if you can lighten that weight, even for 1 second, you've done something greater than fame, greater than money, greater than success. You've touched a soul. The words hung in the air, like a final note of a song that no one wanted to end, but the audience didn't know yet. Keanu was holding one last story, one last lesson, deeper and more surprising than anything shared so far, something even Joe himself would not expect. The moment that changed everything. Studio felt different now. The air was thick with respect, as though everyone inside had silently agreed that they were no longer part of a simple interview, but witnesses to something far greater. Joe's expression had shifted from curiosity to something closer to awe. And yet, he leaned forward again, sensing that Keanu still carried something he had not shared. Keanu, Joe said carefully, you've told us about pain, silence, and kindness. You've shown us how resilience comes from rising after you've broken. But let me ask you this. What was the single moment in your life that changed everything? The moment that defined who you are today? The audience held their breath. The cameras zoomed closer. Even the crew, who had seen hundreds of guests before, leaned in. Keanu's single quote's eyes lowered. For a long time, he didn't speak. The silence stretched, but instead of discomfort, it created suspense. Finally, he lifted his gaze, his face calm, but his eyes carrying the weight of years. There was a day. He began slowly, when I was walking through a hospital. My sister was there for treatment, and I was exhausted. I felt helpless, useless, and angry at the world. I walked past a children's ward, and through the glass, I saw a little boy sitting up in bed. He was thin, weak, but his eyes were full of light. He smiled at me, even though he was the one fighting for his life. That smile hit me like lightning. It made me realize how fragile life is, but also how powerful hope can be. The audience's eyes filled with tears as Keanu's voice grew steadier. I walked into his room, and we talked. He told me about superheroes, about how he wanted to be strong like them. And Joe, do you know what he said? He said, one day, I'm going to save people, just like the heroes in movies. He said it while hooked up to tubes, fighting for every breath. And I thought to myself, if this child can dream of saving others while fighting his own battle, then I have no excuse to give up. That moment changed me forever. I promised myself that I would live in a way that honored that boy's courage. Joe's voice was hushed, filled with emotion. Did you ever see him again? Keanu shook his head slowly. No, Joe. I don't know what happened to him, but I carry his words with me every day. That boy taught me that strength is not about what you achieve. It's about what you give, even when you have nothing left. He gave me hope when I had none, and that became my life lesson. Always give hope, because you never know who is about to give up. The audience broke into soft applause, some wiping away tears. Joe leaned closer, his voice trembling with sincerity. So, that's your biggest lesson? To give hope, even when you're hurting yourself? Keanu nodded. Yes, because pain doesn't cancel kindness. Struggle doesn't cancel love. Sometimes, The greatest gift you can give is a smile, a word, a moment of light in someone else's darkness. That boy gave me that light, and I've been carrying it ever since." Joe stared at him for a long time before speaking again. "You? No, man. This conversation is unlike anything I've had on this show. People will watch this and they'll carry it in their hearts. I can feel it." Keanu leaned back, his expression calm but filled with quiet fire. "That's all I want, Joe. Not fame, not applause. Just to leave behind a trail of light, so that when I'm gone, someone else will find the courage to keep walking." The studio erupted in applause, not the loud, empty kind, but the kind that comes from deep respect, the kind that shakes people to their core. But Keanu wasn't finished yet. He still had one final story to share, one that would not just inspire, but shock Joe, the audience, and everyone watching at home. A story no one had ever heard before. The confession no one expected. The studio was still echoing with the soft applause when Joe leaned forward again, his voice lower now, almost like he was afraid to disturb the weight of the moment. "Keanu, you've told us about pain, resilience, silence, kindness, and that boy who gave you hope. But I feel like you're holding back something even deeper, something you've never said out loud before." The audience grew tense. Even through the screen, viewers at home leaned in closer. Everyone could sense that there was one last truth resting on Keanu's shoulders, waiting to be spoken. Keanu looked down, his hands clasped together. For a long time, he didn't say a word. Joe didn't interrupt. He gave the silence space, letting Keanu gather his strength. Finally, Keanu lifted his head, his voice softer than before, but steady. "There's something I've never admitted publicly, Joe. Not in interviews, not in magazines, not even to most of my friends. And I'll share it now, because maybe someone watching needs to hear it. The truth is, there was a time when I thought my life had no value. I thought I was just a shadow moving through the world, waiting to disappear." The audience froze. Joe's eyes widened, but he said nothing. Letting Keanu continue. "I would finish work, go home, and sit in an empty apartment. No laughter, no family, just silence. I had money, I had fame, but inside I felt hollow. I told myself, you don't matter. If you vanished tomorrow, the world would not notice. I carried that thought for years. People saw the movies, the smiles, the handshakes, but behind closed doors, I was fighting a battle with myself, and some nights, I nearly lost." His words struck like thunder. The audience shifted, some covering their mouths, some fighting tears. Joe's expression softened, his usual tough demeanor replaced with quiet compassion. "What stopped you, Keanu? What kept you from giving up?" Keanu's eyes glistened, though he didn't let the tears fall. "It was one thing, a promise I made to myself. I remembered the boy in the hospital, my sister, and even that stranger on the bench. I told myself, if you can't live for yourself right now, then live for them. Carry their dreams, carry their words, carry their light until you find your own again." And slowly, day by day, I started to rebuild. I stopped asking why I was alive, and started asking how I could make my life useful. And that question gave me purpose. The silence in the room was unbearable and beautiful at the same time. Joe finally spoke, his voice raw. "So you survived because you chose to live for others, even when you couldn't live for yourself?" Keanu nodded. "Yes. And in doing that, I learned something powerful. When you live for others, eventually you learn how to live for yourself, too. Giving hope to others became the way I found my own hope again. It was not fast. It was not easy. But it was real." The audience erupted in applause again, this time louder, longer, filled with admiration. Some stood up, clapping through tears. Joe shook his head slowly, in disbelief. "Man, people watching this right now, you're saving lives. I'm not exaggerating. Someone out there, sitting in silence, thinking their life has no value. They're hearing you, and they're changing their mind. That's bigger than anything. Keanu's face softened into a gentle smile. If that happens, Joe, then all of this pain I've carried was worth it. Because maybe the reason I went through all of it was so I could sit here today and tell that person, don't give up. The world is waiting for you to stand up again. The audience burst into another round of applause. But beneath the clapping, everyone knew something undeniable. This was no longer just a podcast. It was a lifeline. And yet, Keanu's voice carried one more note of suspense as he added, but Joe, there's one last thing I want to say, one final lesson I've learned, the hardest one of all, and maybe this is the one people won't expect. The crowd hushed instantly. Joe leaned in closer, eyes sharp, voice barely above a whisper. And what is that lesson? Keanu took a long pause, his eyes steady, his tone filled with quiet. Gravity. The hardest lesson I learned is that forgiveness is the key to freedom. And Joe, I had to learn how to forgive myself. The audience gasped softly, realizing the story was about to reach its most unexpected truth. The hardest lessons studio was silent again, but this silence was different from before. It wasn't heavy with pain, it was heavy with anticipation. Everyone knew Keanu was about to share the deepest truth, the one he had carried for years. Joe Rogan leaned in closer, his voice soft but urgent. You said the hardest lesson you learned was forgiveness. Forgiving yourself. Can you explain what you mean by that? Keanu took a deep breath. His eyes looked distant for a moment, as if searching through shadows he had walked 1,000 times. Then he spoke, his words slow, deliberate, each one carrying weight. For a long time, Joe, I hated myself. I blamed myself for things I couldn't control. I blamed myself for not saving my father, for not saving my sister, for not being there in moments when people I loved needed me most. I carried guilt like chains. Every mistake, every loss, every regret, all lived inside me, and I punished myself for surviving when others didn't. The audience sat frozen, their hearts aching with him. But here's the truth I had to learn. Keanu continued, his voice trembling just slightly. If you never forgive yourself, you never heal. You stay trapped in the past, living inside wounds that never close. I thought holding on to guilt was a way of honoring the people I lost, but I was wrong. It was only killing me slowly. One day, I realized that if I truly wanted to honor them, I had to forgive myself. I had to accept that I am human, that I make mistakes, that I cannot control everything, and that forgiveness didn't erase the pain, but it gave me the freedom to keep living. Joe's eyes glistened as he whispered, that takes courage. Man, most people never reach that point. Keanu gave a small nod. It does. Because forgiving yourself is not easy. It's not a single moment. It's a journey. Every day, I wake up and remind myself, you are not your past. You are not your mistakes. You are not your losses. You are what you choose to do with today. And when I made peace with that, I felt lighter. I felt free. The audience erupted into applause, but many clapped through tears. This was more than a story. It was a mirror reflecting their own lives, their own guilt, their own need for forgiveness. Joe leaned back, shaking his head in disbelief. Keanu, I don't think people were ready for this conversation. You came here, and instead of just telling stories, you gave us a guide to life. Pain, silence, kindness, resilience, hope, and now forgiveness. That's more powerful than anything. Keanu's face softened with a humble smile. I'm not a teacher, Joe. I'm just a man who has been broken and learned to stand again. But if my story helps even one person keep walking, then it was worth sharing. The applause swelled again, louder than before. Some stood, others clapped quietly, but all of them knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. Joe looked directly into the camera, his voice strong. For everyone watching this, I hope you understand what Keanu is saying. Life will break you. Silence will haunt you. Guilt will try to bury you. But kindness, resilience, hope, and forgiveness, they will save you. Carry that with you. Keanu leaned forward for one last time, his eyes steady, his words clear, almost like a final gift to the world. Don't give up. The world is waiting for you to stand up again. Even if you feel worthless, even if you feel broken, your story isn't over. And sometimes, the light you're searching for is the one you carry inside yourself. The studio fell silent one last time, and then the room exploded into applause, not just for an actor, but for a man who had turned his suffering into wisdom, and his scars into lessons that no one expected. The cameras cut, but the echo of his words would live far beyond the studio walls.